In this part of his book, our author went beyond identifying Israel's boundaries and focused on the particular portions assigned to specific tribes. As we're about to see, these allotments were problematic because some tribes received larger and better inheritances than others. Not surprisingly, the books of Judges, Samuel, and Kings tell us that these disparities led to all kinds of distrust, abuse, division, even war among the tribes. To help his original audience deal with these kinds of troubles, our author called for them to respect the specific tribal allotments that God had established in the days of Joshua.
We'll look at our author's presentation of the specific allotments of Israel's inheritance in our usual way. First, we'll examine its basic structure and content, and second, we'll explore its original meaning. Let's turn first to the structure and content of this part of Joshua. The record of Israel's specific tribal allotments in chapter 13, verse 15 through chapter 21, verse 45 can be confusing. It contains long lists of peoples, regions, cities, towns, and villages interspersed with a number of brief stories and quick asides. To grasp the main ideas in all of this variety, it helps to see that it divides into two main parts: the tribal allotments Moses directed in Transjordan in chapter 13, verses 15 through 33, and a much larger record of the tribal allotments that Joshua directed in Cisjordan in chapter 14, verse 1 through chapter 21, verse 45. The record of tribal allotments in Transjordan is rather short. It begins with the tribe of Reuben in chapter 13, verses 15 through 23. The tribe of Gad appears in verses 24 through 28. And the half-tribe of Manasseh's allotment in Transjordan follows in verses 29 through 31. Then, our author closed this section as he did the preceding section, by mentioning the special inheritance of the tribe of Levi in verses 32 and 33.
Because the tribe of Levi was chosen as the tribe that served and executed the service of the priesthood for the entire nation of Israel, the tribe did not receive any land inheritance. It said in Joshua chapter 13 that God was their inheritance. Because of this, the tribe of Levi was excluded from the allotments among the 12 tribes of Israel. And the portion the tribe of Levi received was the offerings that were made by the Israelites, the gifts and tithes given by the entire nation of Israel.
In these verses, the author of Joshua carefully delineated which portions of lands to the east of the Jordan were allotted to Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. From a large-scale perspective, these allotments may seem clear enough, but for these tribes, the divisions were not as straightforward. Overlapping territories and disagreements over borders made our author explain in some detail to whom specific regions and even towns and villages belonged.
When modern Christians read chapters 13 to 22 in the book of Joshua, they encounter something that does not really capture our imagination, and that is these long lists of boundaries for this tribe, and this tribe had these cities, and those tribes had those cities, and so on it goes. In fact, sometimes when people read these as modern people, they look at it and say, what in the world does this have to do with religion, or what's this have to do with faith at all? Well, in the original setting of the book of Joshua, it had a great deal to do with the faith of Israel and their walk with God as individual tribes and as a unified people. Because we have to remember that God as the king had given or allocated places in the world where each of the 12 tribes of Israel were to exist. It was to be their permanent inheritance, something that they were to hold on to and was to actually be the orientation, their homeland, their piece of the homeland for the entire nation of Israel.
Following this, our author gave a much longer record of the specific tribal allotments Joshua made in Cisjordan. These materials divide into 6 main sections. They begin in chapter 14, verses 1 through 5, with a brief opening summary of Joshua's actions and how they reflected what Moses had already done in Transjordan. This section also notes more than once that Joshua's assignments of inheritances in Cisjordan were in accordance with the will of God. In balance with this first portion, the record of allotments in Cisjordan ends with a closing summary in chapter 21, verses 43 through 45. Our author explained in chapter 21, verse 43, that all the tribes took possession of their lands and they settled there. And to indicate to his audience how ideal the situation was, our author closed this entire section in verse 45 with the declaration that not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass.
In Joshua 13 through 22, we find the realization of God's covenant promises to Israel. Because in those chapters, we find the land apportionment to the various of the 12 tribes. And particularly noteworthy is chapter 21, verse 45, that not one of God's promises had failed. Pointing the reader back to what God had promised to Abraham, to give him a place, to make him a people, and to be present among his people. And when the land is fully apportioned, we now see Israel resting in the promised land that God had promised Abraham long ago, starting back in Genesis chapter 12.
4 main sections stand between these two bookends. They begin with Judah, Israel's most prominent tribe, in chapter 14, verse 6 through chapter 15, verse 63. According to these verses, Judah received a very large inheritance, stretching southward to the Negev and toward the boundary of Edom. To the west, the border reached the land of Philistia and extended along the coast of the Mediterranean as far as the Wadi of Egypt. It reached northward along the Mediterranean coast slightly north of Jerusalem, or Jebus, as it was called at the time, and to the east as far as the Dead Sea. It's understandable why our author placed Judah's allotment first in this list and highlighted how much Judah had received. According to Genesis chapter 49, verses 8 through 12, Judah was destined to be the royal tribe of Israel. Our author highlighted the honor given to Judah first by providing a short narrative about the lands given to the prominent Judahite warrior Caleb. Then, he went on to mention by name some 126 towns and villages in Judah's territory, far more than he listed for any other tribe. After the record of Judah's southern allotment in Cisjordan, we find a second lengthy record, the prominent allotments given to the tribes of Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, in chapters 16 and 17. Ephraim and Manasseh received a great deal of land in the northern regions of Canaan. Their allotment extended from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, with Ephraim south of Manasseh. These territories were among the most fertile in all of the Promised Land. In addition to this, you'll recall that half of the tribe of Manasseh had already been given land to the east of the Jordan. It's no wonder that these tribes received the honor of possessing such a large and rich portion of Israel's inheritance. As Genesis chapters 48 and 49 explain, Ephraim and Manasseh were Joseph's sons. And Joseph was greatly honored because he was so faithful to God in Egypt. He replaced Reuben as Jacob's firstborn and received the firstborn's double inheritance through his 2 sons.
So Ephraim and Manasseh are Joseph's sons. They're not sons of Jacob, Jacob being the man who got his name changed to Israel. And Jacob had these 12 sons. One of them, Joseph, was sold as a slave in Egypt. And then another, Levi, he was sort of withdrawn from the count of the 12 when the Lord decided to take for himself the tribe of Levi instead of all the firstborn of the people of Israel. And then the blessing of Jacob he went to bless the sons of Joseph, and he articulated his blessing over Ephraim and Manasseh. And it's as though those two take the place in the numbering of Levi and Joseph. And so when they go to divide up the land, apportion the land among the 12 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh each receive an allotment of land, a tribal inheritance, and then Joseph is represented in his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh.
Chapter 16 begins with a brief overview of all of Joseph's lands in Cisjordan, and then gives specific details about the tribe of Ephraim. Following this, in chapter 17, the narrative moves to the tribe of Manasseh, including the story of Zelophehad's daughter's land inheritance from Numbers chapter 27. And this section concludes with Joshua's explanation of why Ephraim and Manasseh received more land due to their large numbers. The prominence given to the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh is striking because these tribes caused all sorts of troubles by the time our book was written. But our author indicated that, despite this history, Israel should acknowledge how God had honored the tribes of Joseph. After dealing with the land allotments to the prominent tribes of Judah, Ephraim and Manasseh, our author turned to the minor tribes in chapters 18 and 19. He began in chapter 18, verses 1 through 10, with a narrative of how Joshua called for representatives of each tribe to survey these lands. And he closed in chapter 19, verses 49 through 51, with a story indicating that the tribes approved of these arrangements because they gave Joshua his own special family inheritance. Between these opening and closing narratives, our author recorded the allotments for Israel's minor tribes of Benjamin, Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan. Although these tribes received inheritances, they didn't receive nearly as much as Judah, Ephraim, and Manasseh. And in later times, these lesser tribes had difficulties maintaining their lands. Our author himself mentioned in chapter 19, verse 9, that the inheritance of Simeon was actually in the midst of Judah's inheritance, a fact that eventually led to the assimilation of Simeon into Judah. And he also noted in chapter 19, verse 47, that the territory of the people of Dan was lost to them, a story we read in Judges chapter 18. Knowing that these and other instabilities troubled the minor tribes, our author wrote to ensure that his audience acknowledged these allotments. Joshua's allotments in Cisjordan also include a record of the tribe of Levi in chapters 20 and 21. The author of Joshua began his record of the tribe of Levi by naming the cities of refuge in chapter 20, verses 1 through 9. According to Exodus chapter 21, verses 12 through 14, and Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 1 through 13, these cities offered protection for those who committed unintentional homicide until Israel's courts could determine their guilt or innocence. Following this, in chapter 21, our author listed the Levitical cities in general, following Moses' instructions in Numbers chapter 35, verses 6 through 34. The cities of refuge and other Levitical cities were scattered throughout the territories of other tribes in the land of Israel. This made it possible for the Levites to lead every tribe in God's service. Unfortunately, these allotments were easily forgotten in times of trouble. But the author of Joshua insisted that his audience must remember them because the service of the Levites was so crucial to the well-being of the nation. With the structure and content of these specific tribal allotments in mind, we should briefly summarize the original meaning of these chapters.
Modern audiences often have difficulty appreciating the geographical details that the author of Joshua included in these chapters. But his call wasn't just for Israel to secure their initial national inheritance. He also called them to recognize the specific status and differences God had established for each tribe, so that they could move forward in furthering the spread of God's kingdom.
In his usual style, our author wove his 5 recurring themes into his record of Israel's specific tribal allotments. In the first place, he stressed the divine authority that directed the distribution of lands among the tribes. In his record of allotments in Transjordan, our author remarked 4 times in chapter 13, verses 8, 15, 24, and 29, that these were the divisions of lands that Moses, God's divinely authorized leader, had given them. Our author also indicated the divine authority behind the tribal allotments in Cisjordan. In his opening summary in chapter 14, verse 1, he wrote that Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun and the heads of the tribes established the divisions of the land. He made the same point in his record of Ephraim and Manasseh in chapter 17, verse 4. And we see this again in his discussion of the minor tribes in chapter 19, verse 51, and in his treatment of the tribe of Levi in chapter 21, verse 1. In addition to this, our author introduced the inheritance of the tribe of Levi in chapter 20, verse 1, in his customary way, saying, "Then the Lord said to Joshua." The implications for everyone in the original audience were clear enough. Dissatisfaction with these specific tribal allotments amounted to dissatisfaction with what God had directed. In the second place, as the author of Joshua dealt with Israel's specific tribal allotments, he also emphasized that these divisions were based on God's covenant. The author repeatedly referred to the portions of land allotted to the tribes as their inheritance, using the Hebrew word nachalah. As we mentioned before, this term was closely tied to God's covenants with Abraham and Moses. In chapter 13, verse 32, he called the Transjordan lands Israel's inheritances. In verse 33, he identified the Levites' special portion as their inheritance. In his opening summary of allotments in Cisjordan, he used the term inheritance in chapter 14, verses 1, 2, and 3. He also spoke of Judah's land as an inheritance in chapter 14, verses 9 and 13, and chapter 15, verse 20. He did the same with Ephraim and Manasseh in chapter 16, verse 4, and 7 more times. And he called the minor tribes' allotments an inheritance some 17 times. And in his last account of the tribe of Levi, in chapter 21, verse 3, he spoke of how each tribe gave towns and pasture lands to the Levites from their inheritance. Finally, in his closing summary of this section in chapter 21, verse 43, our author wrote that God had given Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers. All of these references made it clear that these specific tribal allotments were rooted in God's covenant. And if anyone neglected them, they neglected the sacred promise of God to his people as their covenant Lord. In the third place, in his report of Israel's specific tribal allotments, the author of Joshua also stressed obedience to the standard of Moses' law. This emphasis is most clearly seen in his treatment of Cisjordan. His opening summary states in chapter 14, verse 2, that Joshua acted as the Lord had commanded by the hand of Moses. And chapter 14, verse 5 adds that the Israelites divided the land as the Lord commanded Moses. In chapter 17, verse 4, Zelophehad's daughters appealed to what the Lord commanded Moses. The account of the tribe of Levi mentions in chapter 20, verse 2, that Israel was to follow what God had spoken to them through Moses. And according to the closing summary in chapter 21, verses 2 and 8, cities were assigned to the tribe of Levi as commanded through Moses. Our authors appeal to the standard of Moses' law in these chapters called all generations of Israel to observe these divisions of the land. To violate them was to bring the curses of God on his people. To observe them was to bring his blessings. In the fourth place, these chapters also acknowledge that Israel's specific tribal allotments were confirmed by God's supernatural power. The record of allocations in Transjordan mentions the miraculous defeat of King Sihon in chapter 13, verses 10 and 27, and we read of Balaam's killing in chapter 13, verse 22, and of the victory over Og and Bashan in chapter 13, verse 31. All of these events recalled God's supernatural activity in Transjordan. In addition, our author's record of allotments in Cisjordan repeatedly refers to casting lots to indicate God's supernatural involvement. As passages like Numbers chapter 36, verse 2, and Proverbs chapter 16, verse 33 explain, casting lots was one of the ways God supernaturally revealed his will to Israel. The opening summary of Cisjordan mentions casting lots in chapter 14, verse 2. And casting lots appears in the allotments to the minor tribes, some 11 times. Israel also cast lots for the inheritance of the tribe of Levi in chapter 21, verses 4 and 10. Our author's purpose for these repeated notices of God's supernatural involvement is not difficult to discern. Members of the original audience may have been tempted to deviate from these tribal allotments, but time and again our author demonstrated that these allotments were not to be violated because God himself established them.
It is interesting in Joshua that they actually cast lots to see who got what land. And I think this shows that it was in God's hands, that there wasn't going to be any inequality, even with Joshua choosing who gets what. But it's God's giving this to them, and by casting lots, it is pointing to this significance that, again, this is God and his people, and God's giving this to his people in fairness. And there is this idea, I think, that needs to be understood, that God will uphold the property rights of these people, and inheritance is very important for them. And it's interesting also that this land will not go, no one can lose this land forever. That if they even sell off their land, there comes a point where there's a jubilee where the land has to be returned. And so all of this is tied to the fact that this is their inheritance from God, that this is their right given by God, and God is upholding these boundaries, and no one, not even a king, can come along and say, this isn't your land. Kings tried to, but not by law. They couldn't do that because it was God's gift to them and their inheritance from him as his people.
In the fifth place, like earlier chapters in the book, these chapters on Israel's specific tribal allotments also stress the inclusion of all Israel. We can see this emphasis in the way the record of allotments in Transjordan specifies lands for each tribe to the east of the Jordan. The record of allotments in Cisjordan does the same. It not only reports what was given to the tribes of Judah, Ephraim, and Manasseh, but also what was given to the minor tribes. And beyond this, it even specifies the cities devoted to the tribe of Levi. Our author's detailed attention to all of the tribes of Israel reinforced his firm belief that all Israel must reside in the promised land. By the time our book was written, some tribes had been absorbed by others. Other tribes had lost territories to enemies here and there. And by the time the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel and the Babylonians conquered Judah, only a remnant of the people of God remained in their tribal inheritances. But our author insisted on an ideal for which every Israelite should strive. All of Israel was to have its rightful portion of the Promised Land.